Hey everyone, welcome to another video. In this video, we'll try and understand the implications of GST on different types of rental services. We'll talk about two main cases. In the first case, you have a person letting out a commercial property to another person. And in the second case, you have a person letting out a residential property to another person. Centering around these two cases, we'll talk about around 10 situations wherein we'll try and understand who has a responsibility to pay GST on different types of rental services. So first, let's take the case of a commercial property. In the first situation, you have the landlord who has obtained a GST registration and he's provided rental services in respect of commercial property to the tenant who also has a GST registration. So in this case, both the landlord and the tenant both are GST registered and the property in question is a commercial property. So obviously in this case, because the landlord is registered and is providing rental service in respect of commercial property, he has to pay GST directly to the government on something called as a forward charge, which is basically a situation where you are the provider or you are providing taxable services and you have a GST registration. You are liable to pay GST directly to the government after collecting the same from the recipient on forward charge. We'll take the case of the same commercial property, but in this case the landlord has obtained a GST registration. The tenant, however, does not have a GST registration, unlike the last situation. In this case again, since the landlord is providing rental services in respect of commercial property and he has a GST registration, he is again liable to pay GST directly to the government on forward charge. Quite easy to understand. But the third situation is quite different. This is the same commercial property in picture. However, the landlord in this situation, unlike the last two situations, does not have a GST registration. But the tenant or the person receiving services has a GST registration. In this case, what the government says is that because these pertain to rental services in respect of commercial property and the tenant is registered under GST, the landlord does not have a GST registration. The tenant is directly liable to pay GST to the government on something called as reverse charge. Reverse charge is the opposite of forward charge. It is a situation where the person receiving services, in this case the tenant, is liable to pay GST to the government. So this is a unique case wherein the recipient or the tenant is liable to pay GST. The last situation is quite easy to understand. Taking the same case of the commercial property, you have the landlord who does not have a GST registration. Neither does the tenant. Landlord and tenant are not GST registered. Even though the property in question is a commercial property, there's absolutely no question of GST in this particular transaction. So this concludes the first case wherein we discussed about commercial property and 4 different situations, and we understood that there's a situation wherein the tenant or the person receiving services, if he has a registration and the landlord does not have a registration, the tenant is liable to pay GST on reverse charge basis. Now taking the second case of a residential property. Now residential properties can be used for both commercial purposes as well as for pure residential purposes. Say there's a guest house and the guest house is taken on hire or lease by a company. The company is of course putting up its employees to stay in that particular guest house, but ultimately it's for the purpose of the company or for a commercial purpose because the service receiver in this case is the company. So the example of guest house comes under the case of a residential property being used for a commercial purpose because the ultimate recipient is the person using it for a commercial purpose, the company being the case in the example. So in this particular situation, you have the landlord who has a GST registration. You have the tenant or the company who also has a GST registration. Quite obvious and easy to understand since both landlord and tenant have GST registrations. The landlord is liable to pay GST to the government on forward charge. Keeping the same case in picture, that is a residential property being used for commercial purpose, landlord has a GST registration. The tenant or the person receiving services does not have a registration. The landlord is liable to pay GST on forward charge because he's providing a service in respect of a residential property, though used for commercial purposes, and he has a GST registration, is liable to pay GST on forward charge. The third situation is again unique here because you have a residential property being used for a commercial purpose, but the landlord does not have a GST number or is not GST registered, the tenant has a GST number. Again, the government in this particular case says that the tenant is liable to pay GST on reverse charge because he is recipient of services, the landlord does not have a registration, and the service in question is rental services associated with the residential property being used for a commercial purpose. So because it is for commercial purpose, because the tenant is registered under GST, he will have to pay GST on reverse charge basis, even though the landlord does not have a registration. Taking the same case, again, the landlord does not have GST registration, the tenant also does not have a GST number. In this situation, although it's used for commercial purposes, both the parties does not have a GST registration, therefore there is no question of GST being payable in this particular transaction. So this is a case of a residential property being used for commercial purposes where we discuss 4 situations. The next one is the last case where you have a property which is residential in nature but used purely for residential purposes alone and not for any commercial purpose. So in this case, when it's used purely for residential dwelling as it's called, irrespective of whether the landlord or the recipient has a GST number or does not have a GST number, because the service is being provided as rental services but for residential purposes purely, there is absolutely no question of GST. GST is exempted in this particular transaction. So to put in simple words, as a conclusion, if you are on the receiving end or you are the tenant and you are taking a property on rent, it is for a commercial purpose, maybe for a profession or a business. Even though the nature of the property may be residential, it is for a commercial purpose and you have a GST number, that means you are GST registered. If your landlord does not have a GST registration, you are liable to pay GST to the government on reverse charge. This is the most important takeaway from this particular video. Well, I hope I was able to make things clear through this particular video. If you like this video, please do show support to us by hitting the like button. If you want more videos like these on a regular basis by way of notifications, you could also think of hitting on the subscribe button. Till then, I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care and thank you.